What's got the worst blast radius from an incident perspective if someone wants to abuse privileges of any sort, right? And this is important. We don't just necessarily mean like high privileged or, what we would consider as privileged accounts in sort of the classic days. It may be actually looking like, look, any access in production is sensitive enough from these certain systems that we've got to treat it all as privilege.
Welcome to a new episode of All Aboard, the show where we have real conversations with IT and security practitioners. No fluff, no talking points, just straight talk from experts and advice for tackling the toughest problems facing cloud-forward companies today. I'm your host, Alex Bovee, CEO and co-founder of Conductor One. Welcome to the All Aboard podcast. Joining me this week is identity expert and founder of We Have Identity, Ian Glazer. Ian is an identity veteran with tons of experience in the domain, and he's also the founder of We Have Identity, an advisory service helping organizations create, mature, and scale their identity capabilities. If you're in the identity space, you're definitely familiar with the concept of least privilege access and zero standing privileges. Everybody's talking about it right now, but what does it mean and how do we get there? In this episode, Ian and I go into depth on the topic. He gives us a framework for thinking about least privilege access, and we explore a bunch of practical approaches and tactics. I won't waste any more time. Let's jump right in. Ian, thanks for joining the podcast. I appreciate it, man. I'm stoked about what we're going to be talking about today, which is zero standing privilege and least privilege access with very much an expert in the field. But maybe before we jump into it, you could just tell the audience a little bit about yourself. Who are you? I know you're very new to identity, so maybe you could
just
talk about your history. Yeah, exactly. Talk about your history and identity a little bit, or however you want to do the intro.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm Ian Glazer, president and founder of We Have Identity, which is really I help product companies sort of do better in identity and security and privacy with product management, go-to-market, things like that. But I've been in the identity space for a little while. Don't want to say the number out loud because it sort of starts to make you do math. And then, I got to find somebody else to do the math because it's that many years. But I've played almost every role one can play around identity. Sales engineer, field support, consulting engineer, marketing analyst, product manager. Yeah, pretty much every role. Most recently, before I started Weave, I was running identity products and services at Salesforce, part of the Salesforce platform, and was part of that family for 9 years, which was super fun. And before that, I was actually at Gartner by way of the Burton Group. So been around for a while and sort of causing trouble the whole time.
I love it. That's awesome. And given your background in identity, we could go in a million different places. And actually, it might be really fun to have an Ian Glazer series here where explore.
Okay. I think you lose some audience members after a while.
Step at a time. But today, I'm really excited to just jump in and talk about least privilege and zero standing privilege. Sure. I think there's been so much discussion around this, and maybe just even before we get deep into a few of the different topics around it, I know you've written about it on the podcast, on the We Have Identity blog, and had a bunch of uptick there. Can you just demystify it for us? What do those two terms mean?
Sure.
Maybe let's just start there.
Yeah, so let's start with the one that people probably are more familiar with, which is the principle of least privilege, which says essentially you give someone a user account, a service account, what have you, as the name implies, the least amount of privilege that user account needs to perform the tasks that it needs to get done, right? So essentially give them what they need and no more. Cool. And the mission is a noble one, right? But often least privilege sort of degrades, if you will, into quarterly access certifications or yearly access certifications, oftentimes fairly granular. And when they're not very granular, which is to say when they're at a lower entitlement level, like a group or a role assignment, the people involved in the process don't know what they're actually reviewing. And that's no fault of theirs. It's just that we don't have all the data to give them to actually help explain, this thing enables Ian to do X, Y, Z. But regardless, even if you did least privilege, what you would end up with is there is some amount of privilege left over. Essentially, this is standing privilege. These are the things that are in your user account that enable that user account to do something, whether you're using that account or not. And that's the sort of critical thing, is to say, oh, right, just because I'm not logged into this production system over here or this database over here. That user account exists. It is granted entitlements. That means that if that account was to be used without, say, my consent, right? So an adversary takes over the account, then they can do all the things I can do because that account has all that access just sitting there. So enter the notion of zero standing privilege, which says, ideally, get rid of all standing privileges associated with the user account. So all you really do is you have a user record, it has a persistent identifier, and when you create a session or when you issue a token on its behalf, then you grant some amount of privileges for that duration, and that goes away when the session is over or the token expires. So that even if an adversary was to, say, breach a system and essentially swap over to your user, there would be no privileges to abuse because there's none that's there at the time. So it takes the ideas of least privilege and it starts to say, we can take that spirit and say, what should be the North Star flag we want to plant, especially in sensitive, especially in production systems where even the amount of standing privilege, even if you've done least privilege, is still a lot, which means there's an exposure window that's pretty big and that we can find a way to minimize that exposure window.
Yeah, makes sense. And I remember when we were talking, so we met at Identiverse, I guess it was a few weeks ago, almost a month ago.
I mean, just a few weeks ago. Wow.
Feels like
either a year ago or yesterday. I don't know which.
Yeah. And one of the things that we were kind of riffing on a little bit is least privilege access the destination, or is zero standing privilege the destination? Kind of, I guess it's a little bit of like a weird abstract question, but can you talk about, like, when you work with companies and you hear people talking about kind of reducing their standing access footprint, how do you communicate that? Do you communicate that under the umbrella of least privilege access, or is it, and zero standing privilege is a part of that, or is really the goal to move to zero standing privileges like across the board for everything? How do you think about it?
It's actually a little of both, and here's why, right? So when I commented on, organizations that do least privilege tend to do two things. They do some amount of access certification, and more often than not, they do some amount of role review. Essentially, hey, this is how we grant entitlements, and we want to make sure that's right-sized for the business role. My experience and things I've seen and talked to people about say those efforts are okay, but there's a bit of fatigue around them, part one. Part two is that the reviews get less useful over time. Right, there's a little bit of repetition poisoning going on in the activity, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so I think least privilege, although a laudable goal, it sort of lacks hard boundaries because it's a little bit hard to know when you've got there. And in fact, it constantly means that you've got to be always looking to see if you are there. Okay, so then let's contrast this. Zero standing privilege is pretty simple. It's like, okay, this user account has nothing assigned to it. The end. And also I have a policy that describes what happens when, through proper means, the individual starts a new session or gets a token. What do we want to grant that individual, that user account? And so I like the idea of saying, we're doing least privilege. That is important to do. It's things that in many cases people are doing because of other requirements, right? Sort of SOX related things or what have you. But that thinking about how to deploy zero standing privilege as actually the North Star for, and we talked about this in Vegas, is starting with the right kinds of systems, right? My production access systems, my source control systems, like just ensuring that where you can, for some of the more sensitive places of your business, reduce that window of exposure as much as you can. And I've talked about some techniques to doing that. There are some systems that allow you to do this a little bit more easily than others, and there's going to be trade-offs in that. But I'd like to say, look, ZSP is a really good North Star, kind of that flag to plant and sort of march towards it. Do I expect everyone to be ZSP everywhere, every system all the time? No, absolutely not. In fact, that's not a good effort. Like, you're wasting calories to go do that. You've got to be very sort of specific in what you want to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's what I love about zero standing privileges. It is very measurable, like very observable. Like, I've either hit this for my AWS infrastructure or I have not. But least standing privilege is kind of like, I don't know, like maybe we're doing
Yeah,
okay.
it's a mindset, right? Right.
Yeah,
It's like it's more of a lifestyle.
yeah,
And what
yeah.
I want to do is be like, no, I want to go here this summer. Like this is where I'm going. And I think that's a little bit of the contrast between least privilege and zero standing privilege.
Right. So in that regard, I guess least privilege is sort of the journey, and zero standing privilege is like a specific approach that you can take for
Yeah.
specific type of systems. I'm curious, like kind of on that tactical level, what are some of the practices, tactics, and or I don't want to say technologies because I don't want to get into vendor stuff, but like maybe just talking a little bit like what are some of those practices that you've seen companies use to kind of successfully control that access sprawl, get to zero standing privilege, and or, help them on that least privilege access journey.
Well, I would say that most organizations are just beginning this journey, right? So let's be very clear about that. Like if you're tuning in and you're like, oh my God, I haven't done this thing, like be cool. You're in the majority. You're in the vast majority.
Calm down,
So
calm
don't
down.
panic.
You're gonna be
First
all
and
right.
So the first thing is, do you have systems? Do these organizations have systems that support ephemeral users? Right. So AWS is a good example of those things, the way they do IAM roles. And so you can say, look, really the account just sort of gets manifest at the time that you instantiate a session, and this is what you assign to it. And so that's really powerful, right? Because then it can say like, oh, okay, well now I can layer on access from a zero basis and then add up for what we need for a certain task. Where some of my history was in Salesforce actually has ways of doing this too, which is, and Salesforce doesn't use this language, but if you look at the way the authorization system is put together, you can really have a user account with very, very few essentially standing birthright capabilities. In fact, really all it does is assign a license. And then you can layer on session-based, session-bounded sets of privilege, right? So these are examples of systems that have reasonable native support for the idea. And so the first place is to know, like, where's this going to be easy? Where's this going to be hard, right? And you got a list of like, where's it going to be easy? Where's it going to be hard? Okay. Then it's, where do I have the worst exposure windows, right? What's got the worst blast radius from an incident perspective if someone wants to abuse privileges of any sort, right? And this is important. We don't just necessarily mean like high privileged or, what we would consider as privileged accounts in sort of the classic days. It may be actually looking like, look, any access in production is sensitive enough from these certain systems that we've got to treat it all as privilege, right? So then you get in this sort of, well, if everything's privileged, nothing is, right? So, okay, fine. What are those systems, right? Like,
Yeah.
let's look at what are those systems? Is there a consistent set of job functions that interact with those systems? There may be, there may not be. But now you're starting to build a list of where would I like to start to close an exposure window for entitlements that are just hanging around in a user count, part one. And part two is, can I start to describe policies for those job functions that interact with it in a way that I can put into some system to help me do ZSP? And so it may be like, look, we have a very classic firefight, come in, patch type scenario. We may have a more service window, regular oriented type work, and we may have one or two other kinds of things. Can we model what that looks like? And then you hope's not a great strategy, but at least you got to check. The things that are making it easy to do CSP and the systems that you want to limit exposure in, is there overlap, right? And can we start there? And the third ingredient is, and not too much to dwell on technology, is for your identity systems that you have today, can you orchestrate this kind of dance where you go through your remove access and then given certain triggers, you can orchestrate the elevation of privilege just for this session and then pull it back away. And that may mean a provisioning event with a timed trigger to deprovision. Like there's a lot of things that you could do, some more cumbersome than others for certain, but what do you got in the toolbox? And you might not have something, you may want to look for something specialized, but you may have ways of approximating it.
Yeah.
And that's an important start because you're building down both that inventory of systems that make it easy, systems you want to minimize, and what are the kinds of functions that you want to model in policy. How you then manifest it becomes a different kind of conversation that's somewhat detached from those first efforts, which is actually a really good thing, right? Because it doesn't say mandatorily you need this flavor ice cream in order to get the job done, right? Like it gives you some flexibility and frankly, an infusion of reality.
Yeah, I also really appreciated the first thing you said, which is that every company's on this journey and most companies are like just getting started. I think I'm sure you feel this way and see this, but I, having worked in technology for most of my career at this point, I tend to live at this world where we're sort of always pushing the envelope, and then you forget that you're pushing the envelope over here with early adopters and people that are kind of aggressively adopting new patterns and novel ways of doing things. But the rest of the world might be just kind of figuring it out and just coming along for this journey. And
We're in a super interesting place in identity right now because, and Identiverse was a good example of that, where during the first keynotes, Andy Hindle, who's the conference chair, asked, how many people is this their first Identiverse? And I'd say about 75% of the people raised their hand. Now, I hazard a guess that 35 to 50% of those people are brand new to identity. Like, I think identity is becoming mainstream. And so we're seeing new faces at these events and new people looking in the technology markets. And I think that's both great news, but it's also very interesting from you got to remember that those people, the how is less important to them. It's
mhm,
outcomes that they care about, right? They're super focused on outcomes of their identity systems and less maybe interested, and probably rightly so, on how it gets done,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Whereas I think those kind of push in the envelope customers, they're steeped in the how it gets done. And they can give you three or four different ways from their infrastructure that they have today to get something done. And they're trying to optimize the architecture for that. It's a very different kind of conversation. It's a very different kind of buyer in the market.
yeah,
And it's an interesting moment where we see this influx of people newer to it who are like, I don't care as much about the plumbing. I mean, identity is, we got a lot of plumbers. We
yeah.
really like our pipes. Uh, and it's just an interesting moment to see the market dynamics because of that.
Yeah, I agree. It's so funny. It just sways you so much when you tend to work with like really forward-leaning kind of technologists a lot because you see like a very different perspective than
Yeah,
you
there's
know,
like a baseline fallacy. It's like, oh, we've always had this level of complexity. Like, no, you're
it's like
like
no,
the
like you're
1% of the
like
1%,
yeah, you're
right?
like
Like, yeah,
you're the tip of the spear. Like
yeah, exactly.
um, so you talked a little bit about one thing that I think I've always had a little bit of a hard time sort of striking the balance around and figuring out how this rationalizes with least privilege access and zero setting privilege is the idea of like birthright access. So the idea that you're going to join a company, you're going to be given a bunch of things for your role based on your job title, based on attributes, whatever the case might be. And a lot of times, maybe those things don't go used. Like maybe that is just expanding kind of the blast radius, if you will, the attack surface of like an identity program for a company. But how do you think about and talk about birthright access in the context of least privilege access? It does, to me, it feels like they are at odds at some level. Like one's very productivity oriented outcome and one is like very security driven outcome. And how do you
Yeah,
rationalize that?
I think everybody's sort of path through that's going to be different because there are some things where, again, coming back to some systems make this easy, right? Some places it's super simple where it's just like, yeah, it's no brainer. Like there is zero standing privilege for all our user accounts. Fine, move on. But then there's some that the birthright entitlements are required, right? And, more often than not, I'm thinking about productivity suites, for
Hmm.
example. Um, ERP packages, things like that, where it's like, there's very robust authorization infrastructure, but it's meant to be longitudinal, right? It's meant to be very durable over time. And as you're asking the question, like, notion that I was going to say something like, well, birthright and those kind of systems don't matter that much. And then I was thinking, the reality is, though, if we are in an age where trust itself is under attack, that this email comes from Ian, right? This person on your podcast is Ian. Well, we're now in a sort of age of queasiness about whether that's a true statement or not. It sort of made me like kind of head fake myself on the like, birthright and productivity systems. Huh. Yeah, maybe that's actually got a different kind of blast radius than I would think about than say a production access system. I don't know what to do with that in this very moment. I'm like,
Yeah.
what would ZSP look like? Could you do it in, say, Zoom, for example? I don't know.
Hmm.
And I'm not picking on Zoom for any reason other than like, it just comes to mind. Like, what would that mean? What would that happen? Like, what would be the implications? Could it be done?
Yeah.
Because from a trust perspective, maybe we're coming to an age where we actually do need to think about ZSP and our productivity suites very differently than like, okay, who had production DNS access and blew us up? Let's go figure that out, right? Two very different outcomes if someone, forges me on a podcast versus someone screws up root DNS for the company. Different.
Right.
Both can have significant impacts.
Well, I think this is like the interesting thought experiment, I would argue, of just like SaaS in general. The SaaS model is like, it was always I don't say cleaner in an on-prem world, but certainly like Dash A accounts, like these privileged account kind of concepts like existed. But the thing that always got my goat a little bit was I worked at Okta for a while, was how you'd bump into companies that just treated like super admin in their cloud directory like nothing kind of special. It's like, oh, we got a bunch of people who have like super admin access in our cloud directory, whether that's Okta or Azure or whatever the case might be. Even though from a security standpoint, those people can escalate privileges across everything. You could change your assignments in AWS. It's all SSO'd and skimmed and all this kind of stuff. And that just never really made sense to me that you would treat that with any less sort of rigor than you would a traditional sort of like privileged access account. It's just the permissions on the people to do the thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's a holdover from the sort of network segmentation days where it's like, well, it's not on their network, so we're okay,
Yeah,
right?
so we're
And
okay.
like, we're fine. Now, I mean, obviously I'm painting a lot of things with one brush, which is not fair. Tangibility of the outcome is something that is abstract, right, in a lot of ways. And I think saying like, well, in service way over there, we've got a bunch of sysadmins, but that's fine. Like,
Yeah.
it's hard to get our heads around the implications of some of these things until something bad goes on, because then it's like, oh, that's how it happens. Like,
Yeah.
threat modeling isn't something that people who are building roles tend to do, right?
Right.
And I'm not knocking people that do IGA and role building at all, but it's like we're all kind of in two businesses at the same time: sales and security. Like, everybody has some aspect. The aphorist of like everyone's selling in an organization. To some degree, that's true. Everyone has a hand in the security story, whether they recognize it or not as well. Now, I mean, the classic way everyone pitches in is MFA. Okay, great. That's good.
Mm.
But I think it's farther reaching than that, of thinking like, hey, maybe we need to think differently. Maybe we need to threat model our role assignments and our processes around that. Like the things that we're assigning in Birthright. When's the last time we went through and did a little least privilege love on these things? I don't know. Well, oh, wait a minute. We add this whole other, say, like document storage system to a Birthright, role and kind of forgot about it like years ago. Maybe it's worth blowing the dust off that thing because we never access certified those things. Why? Because they're a Birthright. Huh. Right. So
Right.
the challenge though is that there is a trade-off, right? The calories spent doing that and the risk mitigated, that math may not work out for some organizations. It may be really important for others. And so it's a little bit hard to do a sort of speculative exercise when you're hard pressed to make the business case for the core functions, right? So I don't know, like I hear you, but at the same time, I'm wondering, how do you operationalize that in a modern era where people are really squeezed for resource and for time to actually execute these processes?
I mean, I think there's definitely something here around. I mean, you touched on it earlier, but at the application level, what applications can even support some of these patterns you're saying? Like, how hard is it? What's the risk of the data? Like, you almost have to kind of go through, I think, at that level to sort of rationalize, like, okay, where do I spend my calories to try to get to zero staying privilege, to implement just-in-time access, to remove unused access, to automate user access reviews? Like, there's just, it's because you can't do all at once. I know people sometimes want to do all at once, but all at once is like impractical.
That's a mild understatement. Impractical, it's more like, here's Don Quixote. Let's see how this turns out. Here's a windmill, right? Like, let's do it all at once. No, not a thing.
It's a journey. Okay, so your last answer really, it hit me in the feels, because I think something I've really been trying to understand and grapple with a little bit in the market is this idea that is identity a security concern? Maybe that's just like the top level question. And I think certainly identity was traditionally, I would argue, owned by IT. Like you said, you're sort of IGA administrators, like doing your role mining and figuring out, what are the roles for these users. But they might not have the lens of, well, what's the security risk of over permissioning? Do we have these patterns of just-in-time access? Should we be trying to move these things to zero-sitting privilege? Like those are kind of security-centric thinking applied to, role-based access control and birthright access and so forth. So I guess, how do you see the evolution of identity as a shared concern between IT and security? And do you think that's going to create tension? Do you think it eventually lives in security? I guess I'm really curious to get your thoughts all up on like IT and security and how they kind of coexist around identity.
So I think I would unask the question slightly, and here's why. Because to me, concepts like threat modeling
Yep.
should be shared skills throughout the IT organization. And if you consider, like, we do threat modeling with our developers when we're building code. Why? Because we need to think about what could go wrong. Is development a security concern? No, but it has real implications for it. And so partnerships between development and security helped us shift left. That's great. So I think it's more that kind of conversation, which says identity has profound security implications. I don't care about the org chart per se, so long as the dollars flow and the mandates flow, right? Like the ability to say, we're doing MFA, for example, in the enterprise. Why does that get done? More often than not, because the CISO grants the mandate, right?
Yeah.
The VP of identity doesn't have that kind of ability organizationally, let's say. And identity is now becoming something where more than just the people that do incident response care about it in the security org, right? Like I was talking to a friend of mine who does incident response, and she was half kidding. She's like, all I want from you identity people is the logs. I'm like, that's not true. What else do you want? She's like, oh yeah, I want to know when accounts get taken over. I want to know when privilege gets escalated. And then I just want the logs, right? And it's got to be more than just after the bomb went off.
Totally.
Those people care about identity, right? Like, so to me, I think there's two activities that are going on or starting to go on, which are really important. One is, in my mind, the ability to provide meaningful signal and information to the SOC so that security operators can do what they need to do, along with run books to say, this is what's going on. That's super important. The other thing that I think needs to go on more of is, in the same way security teams up with development to help shift left, we need to do the same thing with security and identity. And to me, it's about threat modeling and risk metrics, right? And sort of understanding, yes, you have a seat at the table from a productivity perspective, identity. You really help here. But let's think more about some of these other topics, because let's face it, we know how to do the productivity stuff. We don't have the strongest muscle all the time when it comes to threat modeling, to expressing risk. That's lessons we can take from our security peers and actually put into practice.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I love that. It's giving me so many product ideas too. Maybe as a closing question, because we're getting close to time here. Any they don't have to be spicy, but if it's spicy, maybe the better. But any security or identity predictions for 2024 going into 2025?
My head went to something that I may regret saying, but that means it's the perfect thing to say, which is I'm not sure ITDR is going to be around.
Oh, juicy.
Here's why. Here's why. So first off, ITDR I don't think is a thing. I think it's techniques. It's not a market.
It's like a feature.
There's a bunch of things that are useful. There's a bunch of features that are useful to different audiences, but it's not a market, right? It's a feature set in something else. And so that's what I mean. Like, I think ITDR is going to go away, is because I think it's going to get subsumed or fold back into something else. But we're in like this profound moment of change where I think by 2026, the classic boundaries of products and markets are going to be really blurry, and we're already there. Like our old terminology for things like access management is not serving us well anymore.
Totally.
And so I think, some of these features masquerading as markets will change. I'm not a huge fan of the phrase identity security, because to me, there's a triumvirate between identity, security, and privacy. So that implies there's identity security. So there's security privacy, and then there's privacy identity. I don't know what any of that means. It just kind of bugs me from like a wording perspective. I think the other thing that we are on the cusp of is far more real-time evaluation of identity-related policy and generating far higher quality and consistent identity signals to then process, right? So what's going on inside of the OpenID Foundation with Shared Signals Framework and with CAPE is finally hitting stride, honestly, 10 years after some of the ideas were created. And it takes about 10 years for some of these things to come around. And that is important news, because now we can start to have a consistent signal channel and a consistent signal format and a consistent set of messages that enable not just our tools, but our security peers' tools to actually go do something, to both evaluate, to orchestrate, and in some cases remediate, in some cases alert, in some cases simply log for bookkeeping purposes. But we're on this really interesting edge of the moment of real-time identity as a thing that isn't just for that bleeding edge kind of conversation you and I had at the onset of these things, but can start to become more mainstream. And that's a very powerful moment.
I'm excited about that. And also, I agree with your predictions. For what it's worth. They might be spicy, but I do agree with them. And I am looking forward to seeing the evolution of the market. I think, to your point, identity and access management, governance, like a lot of these problem statements feel so blended. Privilege access management in the context of cloud, like these are just such blended problems. And then to your point, also just ITDR is like, yeah, we should be detecting if there's issues and telling people about it, regardless of where it is in the system.
A little cynically, we've moved off of 3-letter abbreviations like PAM and SSO and IGA, and now we're like into 4-letter abbreviations like KIM and, all of these other ones where I'm just like, is that where we're bound? It's like, come 2025, we're gonna have 5-letter, abbreviations for our market spaces, and boy, aren't they going to be great. Like, at some point, like, stop. We got to just get back to like the basics here, and just the tooling we have to do the basics now is actually better than ever. So we can actually get some stuff done.
Yeah, fair enough. I love it. Okay, well, maybe offline, I'm going to ask you for your predictions on acronyms, because maybe I'll sprinkle some of those on our website.
There you go.
Ian, it was great having you on the podcast. Really appreciate it. And looking forward to our follow-up. I've got ideas for follow-up episodes, but I'll pitch you on those later. Thanks, man.
Sounds good. You take care. Bye now.
Thanks for tuning in. This episode of All Aboard is brought to you by the team at Conductor One. We'd love to hear your feedback. Send us a message at allaboard@conductor1.com. Till next time.